I'm Trent England with the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs. Earlier today, the Oklahoma Ethics Commission heard for the second time a proposal to regulate speech and basically create a new category of what they call lobbying. It's not really lobbying. They're calling it indirect lobbying, where if one person tells another person that that second person should contact their legislator, that may be lobbying, right? This isn't lobbying by any traditional definition. We've talked about it a lot in some articles up at OCPAthink.org, and you can also find those on our Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs Facebook page. Here is the video of testimony delivered by Jonathan Small, president of OCPA, and myself before the commission. You can, I think, get a flavor of some of the concerns from this testimony. Good morning, commissioners. Thank you so much. I'm speaking today not just on behalf of myself and the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs, but on behalf of 2,332 Oklahomans who have signed a petition calling for this commission not to adopt this rule. 2,332 Oklahomans and growing, people who have looked at this, looked not only at our analysis, but we pointed people to look at the actual rules and who came to the same conclusion that we have. While it's wonderful that the commission has gone back to the drawing board on this and redrafted some of the parts of this that we raised questions about before, this would still treat the Federalist Papers like a pack of cigarettes in need of a warning label. I mean, let's take ourselves out of the world of 1984. Indirect lobbying is not lobbying, right? And the example that was put up on the screen of an advertisement for a candidate, right? Indirect lobbying is not campaigning for a candidate, right? This is not the same thing. And so it's easy to say, well, this ad sort of looks like that ad, so why wouldn't we impose regulations on this ad because it sort of looks like that ad? This isn't that, right? And all you have to do is go to the constitutional provisions that create the Ethics Commission in the first place to see exactly why that's the case. Because this commission is only charged with policing the ethics of government officials and government employees. And everything I've heard today about the rationale behind this rule, including from the legislator who suggested this rule in the first place, is that it has nothing to do, I mean, it may be very well intentioned, but it has nothing to do with the ethics of our public servants, which is such an important mission. I'm just shocked that we have to discuss this at all. This commission has such an important mission in the state of Oklahoma, right? And yet somehow our eye is off the ball and we're talking about policing the speech of private citizens talking to other citizens, right? Which again has nothing to do, I mean, the one thing that should be being explained here from the very beginning is how this fits within the commission's mandate and why it's even appropriate to have this conversation here rather than in the legislature. If the legislature wanted to engage in this, I mean, if the legislature is that concerned about it, right, they could engage in this kind of regulatory activity. Of course, they'd still have to abide by the First Amendment and the Oklahoma Constitution as well, right? But there is no nexus with the ethics of elected officials or the ethics of government employees and what we're calling indirect lobbying, which again isn't lobbying. It's not campaigning, right? It's something different. And I mean, the second speaker very poignantly described what this is. I'm glad that this has been rewritten to leave out some of the soccer mom example that I gave last time, but it still would capture people. And especially, I mean, this is, as we've talked through this internally, and the Institute for Free Speech analysis is excellent as well. The people on whom this would fall the hardest are the people who create a single interest group, like my soccer mom example a month ago, who say, we want to organize just because of this one piece of legislation that we support or that we oppose, just because we want to get this teacher pay raise through the legislature, right? Because every dollar they raise and spend, right, by definition would be for the purpose of what is called here indirect lobbying, right? So while a larger organization might just collect money based on support for their mission and then engage in little bits of covered activity here and not have to report donors, it's the single issue group, right, which tend to be the smaller groups, tend to be more organic, spring up during one legislative session to take action on one thing, exactly the soccer mom example I offered last time. Those are the people who would be captured by this, for sure, right? Although they might never know it, right, until they make some legislator mad and they wind up in the crosshairs of the commission under this rule. So I mean, there's so many reasons to be concerned about this. Finally, it is very vague, and vagueness in this area of law is not just a sort of a legal drafting problem. Vagueness is a constitutional problem. I suspect you all know that, right? And people have already mentioned some of the specific examples. The Institute for Free Speech is very good at pointing out exactly some of the problems here. Vagueness is a constitutional issue when we're talking about the First Amendment. And I think that, I mean, if nothing else, this needs a lot more work just to come to definitions that everybody could understand. And things like the requirement to put a little disclaimer on there. I mean, if you know how some of these online platforms work, you can't even do that on a Google display ad. I mean, it's technologically impossible to do what would be required here on the most widely used advertising platform that people use. Also wouldn't be practical to do it on Twitter, right? I mean, there are technical problems with this as well. Finally, I mean, this is all supposedly about the public's right to know. At the last hearing, it was mentioned that this has been developed in coordination with the Brennan Center, which I don't like the term dark money, but if for those who do, a dark money group that doesn't disclose its donors, that's a very left-leaning group, not that there's anything wrong with that, that's based in Washington, D.C., apparently has been the one group that's been relied on for the drafting of this rule. We filed a public document request with the Ethics Commission 3.5 weeks ago, asking for the details of that coordination with that group. Still have not received that. And so we certainly would like to understand that coordination with this out-of-state group that's very out of step with the political beliefs of most Oklahomans. Before this rule comes up to a vote, I think that would be appropriate. Thank you very much.
Accept the rule.
Yes. Good morning, Commissioners. I'm the president of the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs. I've had the privilege of serving Oklahomans and worked for state government for about 8 years, starting in the Henry administration in 2003. Before I get to the meat of my comments, I would like for you to remember this date, December 18th, 1907. Remember that date with my comments. I think there's something that's very important for us to remember, and that is transparency is for government, privacy is for people. Intentions are nice, but intentions are not what we are trying to get at. I heard the statement made that if people would not be transparent, then they don't have the right to speak. As a minority, those kinds of ideas are extremely concerning to me. If you will recall American history, unfortunately in the United States of America, while some of our history is great, some of our history is not so great. And you'll recall two important Supreme Court cases, one in which NAACP versus Alabama, and then also Supreme Court or case similar to Florida. In both those cases, the government tried to say that it had a specific interest that was really important and to compel the supporters of those organizations. As you know, minorities at times in the United States of America have faced significant opposition, and often the hammer that has been used against them is the majority's hold on government. What I fear most about this rule is that this rule actually makes it much more difficult for grassroots organizations, community organizing efforts to do things like advance criminal justice reform. It places them in the fear factor, if you will, of if a rule like this was adopted, what ability would someone have? What influence could be brought to bear on them from the DA behind the scene? It also brings on them an exorbitant disclosure and regulatory environment, while some large groups, it's interesting, professional lobbyists, actually they're used to this regime and they're paid for it. People who organize on behalf of issues that are important to them, they don't have that ability. I apologize that my mother wasn't able to attend with me today, but I hearken back to a story about my mother. Many of you know about the disparities in public schools against African American students. So my mom embarked on something that was very interesting. She and my dad made a very interesting move to decide to educate me and my sisters at home, out of their concern that the public school system would discriminate against their children and wouldn't provide equal education, particularly to their African American son. You know, these aren't outlandish ideas. The Oklahoma City Public Schools was actually under a civil rights investigation for inadequately aligning and trying to appropriate children to classrooms purely to get more federal special education dollars. My mom, as soon as she started to homeschool us, she realized that there were actually lawmakers in the legislature who opposed educating your children at home. And so those lawmakers would regularly come to the legislature, file bills to heavily restrict homeschooling. My mom and dad felt like homeschooling was providing a benefit to us, and so they began to organize parents to come to the Capitol for what was known as Capitol Day. And they would pool resources to drive large vans with kids that would come out and pile out, and then they would come talk to lawmakers about bills that intended to encroach on their rights. This bill would have affected my parents. This bill would actually affect my ability today to provide the education that I think is best for my children. Because even today, there are lawmakers who file legislation to attack my ability to educate my minority children at home, where I have them, my 4 daughters at home, because I feel like the public school system won't provide an adequate education for them. This rule would make it much more difficult for us to respond to efforts by current lawmakers to curtail the ability of people like my mother and myself from educating. Finally, I'd ask that you would remember that there's far more important things going on today that this body has to deal with. Right now, you're in the middle of a dispute about lack of funding. So it's clear that if this rule passed, there's no way that you could apply it in a fair manner. You would have to apply this rule based on judgment about who you thought were the worst actors. And that is something that is the most scary to minorities, is when government has the ability to determine when it will or when it won't enforce a law. Generally, the majority always wins in that process. The reason I asked you to think about December 18th, 1907 is because that was the first act of legislation passed by the Oklahoma legislature. Do you know what that act was? It was the enactment of Jim Crow laws. Those lawmakers that passed that bill overwhelmingly, they would appreciate both versions of this rule, because they would have made it difficult for the NAACP in Oklahoma in 1907 and others who tried to organize against it to represent themselves. I appreciate your intentions, but I encourage you to oppose this rule, which would have the most damaging impact on minorities in Oklahoma. Thank you.
If you're as concerned as I am about this issue, I want to encourage you to go to OCPAthink.org. Under the Take Action tab, you can find and sign our petition. If you haven't done that already, please sign the petition to express your concern and opposition to this effort to regulate political speech in Oklahoma. I'm Trent England for the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs. Thanks for watching.